It's My Nerd World and Depeche Mode, the podcast. And on this week's episode, an interview with a studio designer for the band. We'll take a brief look back at the Ultra era and your listener feedback.
Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Dave Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to
My Nerd World.
And welcome to Depeche Mode, the podcast. I'm your host, Jon Justice. Thank you so much for checking out another episode. As always, if you want to email, you can do that. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. And if you happen to be enjoying this on YouTube, leave a comment up on YouTube, and we'll share your listener feedback. We have listener feedback a little bit later on in this week's episode. As I like to start out most of the shows with some news, potentially if I have any, and there isn't any news. The band is quiet. I think I mentioned on last week's episode, I've seen several photographs of fans who have run into either Martin or Dave as they are in, their home areas or around their home or visiting relatives, but still no word on those 4 unreleased tracks, and we'll get into a little bit more of that coming up with listener feedback. It's a question that I get every single week, and still no news relating to the physical release of the Memento Mori tour. But we do have some things to talk about. I'm looking forward to having guests on the show again in the very near future. And this week I want to talk a little bit about the Ultra era. This was inspired by the conversations that people have had with me through the listener feedback, talking about the various eras of the band and looking back on what was the, sort of the peak of the band. And I go and talk about those albums of Music for the Masses, Violator, Songs of Faith and Devotion. And I'm always surprised to see how many people point to Ultra. And going through the book Monument, the entire book of Monument is fantastic. But this particular era around Ultra is one that I don't think I've covered a ton on the show. I know I've done a retrospective on Ultra a few years back. But in terms of getting into what it was like as a fan during this period of time, this period of transition for the band, I'm just increasingly interested and fascinated in, especially from a fan perspective. So what we'll do is we'll go through a bit of what they had to say in the Monument book, the write-up. I want to talk a little bit about Barrel of a Gun. I'll share my story again of the first time that I heard that track. And we'll get into your listener feedback this week. Before we do, though, let's start here. And a new article that I found this past week from Music Radar. I've edited the article down to focus on the relevant aspects relating to Depeche Mode, and also kind of took out some of the more technical jargon in this piece. But the headline goes, he had the most equipment that I've ever seen. Every synth you can imagine. Huge modular setups. I think we were 1,100 modules and counting. And this was a quote from studio designer Jim Keller talking about Martin Gore's studio. And this is written by Andy Jones for Music Radar. From plugging your gear in, creating your tunes, to listening back to the results, there's nothing that beats producing your own music. When everything is running smoothly, that is. When things go wrong in the studio, there can be nothing worse. Nothing more soul-destroying than having a great idea and not being able to convert it into sound. Jim Keller, after working in studios like Avatar in New York and recording with icons like Bob Clearmountain, he and his company, Soundhouse, have become, or might be Soundhouse, H-U-S, have become the go-to studio problem solvers for the likes of Depeche Mode's Martin Gore and the distinguished Juilliard School in New York. Incredibly different projects, but with the same goal, to make a space that is comfortable, creative, and inspiring for music making. Jim Keller comes from a family of builders, but has always had a fascination with recording studios and electronics, not to mention a love for listening to and recording music. Building recording studios then seemed like the obvious career move, but at a time when many large pro recording studios face budget cuts as record companies rely more on streaming than physical sales, designing studios might have a limited scope in terms of a business. Right? Wrong. So they ask him, how did it work with Depeche Mode in their studio spaces? And he says, I felt really lucky and honored to have met those guys, as I was a huge Depeche Mode fan as a kid. And I love reading these types of articles and these interviews of individuals and the creatives that have worked around the band. I just often find that you can get such different and unique perspectives from individuals who've been able to contribute in various ways to the creation of this music that we love. I know for me, and it continues to this day as a Depeche Mode fan, and it certainly rang true going back to when I was much younger during those peak albums that I mentioned earlier, anybody that was attached in any way to Depeche Mode immediately got credibility. Whether it was remixers, individuals, clearly Anton Corbijn being probably the most obvious one, but, any of the other design artists that worked, the graphic artists that worked with the band outside of Anton Corbijn, those that were in charge of the rigs as you would go and see Martin's guitars on the documentaries, individuals like Jim Keller, who's working on studio spaces. A friend of mine was working with Dave Gahan, the singer, so I first built a room for him in New York City. Nothing huge, nothing crazy, a fairly modest place, a songwriting and vocal recording space. And to my point, just the idea of this individual being able to build something for Dave, knowing that he's in his space, creating something that Dave will then subsequently go and use to write not only his own solo music, but to the songs that he's been contributing to the band for a while now. And again, they immediately get credibility to me. A few years after that, Martin Gore reached out because he had an existing studio in California with the most equipment that I have ever seen of anybody's collection. There was a main recording room with every synth you can imagine and huge modular setups. There's another room with keyboards and another which is storage with all kinds of old stuff that's pulled out once in a while. When we did that project for Martin, it was all workflow, technical solutions, custom furniture, custom-built Euro rack. Like one entire wall is a Euro rack. It was all custom-made. The cabinets, power distribution, the rails for the Euro rack. We built everything. I think there were like 1,100 modules and counting. It's funny because as we were building it, every day a few more modules would show up, and so we thought, okay, we should future-proof this. So we built in about 15% extra blank space. So that was 2017. I'm sure it's full now. Martin and Dave were just excellent people and visionary, of course. Being able to help them to offer a solution was a huge honor. It's not like we were helping make the record, but I like to think that I might help clear the path a little. And again, just going back to the fact of people around the band that contribute in any way to the music, and the creative process that we have all come to know and love. I'm so interested when I hear interviews like that. And the other thing about this particular piece that really stuck out to me goes back around to the question of what is the future of the band. I'm always pleased to hear from you and the optimism that you have. Rom, who we talked with on a few podcasts back, and his expectation the band will create more music, and reading about how extensive Martin's equipment is and how much they love to make music, I'm more and more convinced that the band will make music again. And I think the idea that we'll get more music, but perhaps not a massive tour, Those 4 unreleased tracks keep swirling in my mind, and the fact that they haven't been released on anything and we haven't had a word about anything, I can't help but wonder, as others have gone and speculated about perhaps maybe they're being saved for something where they'll create more music and attach those 4 tracks to extra music. They haven't done that in the past. I mean, in minor ways, when songs have shifted from being, one-off singles to going on collections and that kind of thing, or redos like fly on the windscreen, and how that was on the catching up with the greatest hits, ended up going on Black Celebration and things like that. But considering just how extensive Martin's setup is, and seeing the photographs that were that came along with that particular article, I actually got genuinely excited, just going, these guys they're musicians. This is what they love to do. And I haven't gone to really track how long it took them to create Memento Mori, but it seems to me that the creation of that album took a shorter period of time from when they first started making the album to completion. Obviously, we had more years than we've ever had before because of the pandemic. But in terms of the actual album creation, it seemed to me, and I could be wrong, and again, I haven't gone back to look. I'm sure somebody has chronicled the actual length of time from when the band went into the studio, started recording, and when the album was, apparently completed. But it just seems like that period of time was shorter. And the point that I'm trying to make is that I think because both Martin and Dave have the ability to easily create music in their own creative spaces rather than the difficulty of traveling to various locations, using other studios, even though they went out and did use other studios in some of the production of Memento Mori. All that is to say that, you know what, they write some songs, Dave gets on a flight, goes to Martin's studio, they've got their production team on hand, assume just for the sake of this little exercise that it's that it's James Ford again and Marta Solongni, and we could have an album, perhaps not attached to any sort of major tour, but we could have new music. At a bare minimum, my expectation, certainly from Martin's perspective, I don't know about Dave. I think Dave's the big question mark in all of this. Is Dave going to want to continue? Is he going to want to keep making more music, or is he done after this tour? When it comes to Martin, though, I expect Martin will continue to make music. I hope that if for some reason the band doesn't decide to continue, that Martin will create a solo album of songs that he wrote, not another counterfeit covers album. I'd love, because that ends up sort of by default becoming Depeche Mode. Depending on the style of music that he ends up creating, but that's what I hope. I do really enjoy his instrumental albums. I thought VCMG was great. Much different. MG could be the soundtrack to a science fiction, a dark science fiction noir film. When listening to it reminded me of Blade Runner. But I hope that moving forward that we get solo music from Martin and songs that he wrote. And I imagine that would probably happen once they decide to call it quits. I think Martin's kind of hesitated, at least in my opinion, probably has hesitated to go and write his own stuff like Dave did, simply because it would be so much in line with Depeche Mode. Just wouldn't have Dave there. So, as always, in my rambling of this band that I love so much, your thoughts on any of this, drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment up on YouTube. I couldn't tell you much about the sort of the time period and the vibe that I had around the releases after Ultra. I have my stories. Before playing The Angel, getting Precious ahead of time and it being leaked. I have my stories of Sounds of the Universe and what I was going through in terms of my the first open heart surgery that I had, and being in the hospital when Wrong was being debuted on British television. in the hospital, lying there in bed, listening to the demos that had leaked out of Sounds of the Universe. I have my stories around Exciter, right? I think every single album release, we all have the stories to tell. Ultra was such an interesting time. We'd come off such a high from Music for the Masses, Violator, Songs of Faith and Devotion at the conclusion of that tour, and then, of course, just what seemed as if the bottom dropping out of the band between Alan leaving, never forgetting that moment of the fax coming across the machine at the radio station that I was working at in Southern California, KCXX, and learning that Alan was leaving the band and kind of going, oh my gosh. It's like there's a moment there where it's like, my world is shattering. This is odd. What is going to happen? Of course, Dave, his drug overdose. And then to have the band suddenly emerge from this period of time and are able to go and produce another record. And knowing the band was going back into studio, and having gone through those three eras, you become accustomed to, all right, the band has changed their style. What are they going to be this time around? Wondering, what is the font going to be? I'm still fascinated by that. I mean, it still happens with every single album, but I just wonder what Anton Corbijn is going to come up with in terms of the font for the music. What is it going to look like, right? What is going to be what bumper sticker will be adorning the back window of my car? What is that going to look like? Because it'll match whatever the current new music of Depeche Mode is. And Ultra was such a weird time because there was so much that was unknown with a band that we already didn't know what to come to expect. So I thought I'd take a moment here and share a bit of what was written about Ultra and share my comments as well from the Monument book. Alan had left. Dave was living in Los Angeles, addicted to heroin. Andy and Martin were trying to recover in London from the last tour. The future of Depeche Mode did not look rosy. It was much more about, are we going to make another record? And if so, how do we go about it? Said Daniel Miller of The Situation. At the end of 1995, he suggested that the remaining band members, that they all go back into the studio in London to record a few tracks without having the pressure of making the whole album. And as I read this, I'm suddenly rushed back to the promotion and finding out all of this information at the time, right? In the meantime, the whole scene had changed considerably. Techno and hip-hop had succeeded in making commercial breakthroughs in the second half of the 1990s, and the grunge and crossover were ubiquitous. In England, Britpop had emerged and established itself as a globally hyped guitar genre. Oasis, their second album, entering the charts at the top nearly everywhere in the U.S., Oasis was the second British band to land an album in the top 5 after Songs of Faith and Devotion. Meanwhile, other British artists were forging new music, new musical frontiers with samplers and synths. In 1994, Portishead released a somber, decelerated album, Dummy, a fusion of soul, dub, and lo-fi sounds with hip-hop beats and bass lines. Together with Massive Attack, they had laid the foundations for trip-hop, giving electronic music of the 90s a whole new sound. In contrast to Songs of Faith and Devotion, Depeche Mode wanted their new songs to return to an electronic sound and be arranged into more danceable tracks. Daniel Miller and the band chose Tim Simonon as the producer. He had already created a sensation in the late 1980s with his Bomb the Bass dance floor project at Mute. Gareth Jones also collaborated on a few tracks for the first time since Black Celebration. Tim Simonon brought along several people with him to do the job. A sound technician called Q, the keyboard player Dave Clayton, and Carrie Hopwood as programmer. I wanted to be involved in the making of Depeche Mode album, Carrie remembers. And I thought sometimes we're going to be making a Martin Gore solo album because I didn't know for sure if we'd have a singer. Just how Dave was faring, no one really knew, and no one could tell if he had his drug problem under control. And while the band was working on the instrumental side of the album, it wasn't too noticeable. But in the spring of 1996, when the vocals were supposed to be recorded at Electric Ladyland Studios in New York, the magnitude of his heroin addiction and vocal recordings were out of the question. A few failed efforts, it was agreed that Dave should go to a vocal trainer in Los Angeles to try to get his voice back. Dave returned to L.A., but his vocal problems seemed to be only part of the problem. No one was able to halt his downward spiral of self-destruction. Soon afterward, in May, a catastrophe took place. Dave overdosed in L.A. and had to be resuscitated by paramedics. He was literally brought back to life at the last minute. After a spell in the hospital, he was arrested for drug possession, but was released on bail. Jonathan Kessler took care of the bail. A short time later, Dave was sentenced to rehab. He accepted the decision and pulled himself together for a new beginning. Therapy managed to help Dave get clean. He did hit rock bottom, and now things could only take an upward turn. Straight away, he started working with a vocal trainer, Evelyn Hollis, and returned to the studio. I was amazed that he somehow got it together to come back in and sing, reported Tim Simonon. Some of the final recordings were made in the legendary Abbey Road studios in London. And it's interesting when you go back and look at the videos that were done, the promotional photos that were done at the time. You know, it was this strange amalgam of Dave from Violator combined with Dave from Songs of Faith and Devotion that hadn't quite come out yet. You know, the facial hair was gone. He was a little bit worn in the face. The hair was still long, not as long as it was during the time of Songs of Faith and Devotion. It wouldn't be until the singles tour where sort of that old version of Dave, and really a version of Dave that has stuck with him ever since. I find it so interesting that, you know, Dave had that massive transition with Songs of Faith and Devotion and then, you know, returned back to that lead singer on stage that we become so accustomed to. That time period during Songs of Faith and Devotion and subsequently Ultra, even though they never went out and officially did a tour apart from a few of those showcase shows, it's such just an interesting time capsule for the band where they made incredible music, but we almost lost decades worth of enjoyment. And it's a testament to Dave. I've made this comment before on the show that, I mean, how many artists go to, you know, down as low and hit as rock bottom as Dave Gahan did, only to bring themselves back up and survive the ordeal and continue on all these years. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I mean, it's an inspiration to anybody who's ever dealt with any sort of addiction of any kind. You know, anything is possible. And Dave is a clear example of that. I want to jump ahead and just talk briefly before we get to listener feedback about Barrel of a Gun. After Alan's departure, the long silence, and Dave's voice loss and resurrection, a new single was eagerly awaited. How had Depeche Mode sound changed? Was it noticeable that Alan was no longer with them? How did Dave's voice sound? The band performed Barrel of a Gun for the first time at the end of January 1997 on Top of the Pops. The pre-recorded performance featured Anton Corbijn on drums and Tim Simonon on keyboards. By the way, is that true? Was Anton on drums? That feels like a typo to me. All right, I'm not going to look it up right now. You email me. Because I've read through this before, but that just stuck out to me. The song was everything but easy to listen to, or a radio hit, they write in Monument. It had a mammoth drum sound, booming bass, a buzzing electric guitar that made your ears hurt, a battle cry. It reflected the trials that the band had been through over the past few years. The single entered the UK charts at number 4 and in Germany at number 3 after its release on February 3rd of 1997. Depeche Mode was back. So I'll stop here because they go through It's No Good. talking about the one-off shows that they did. They do. I will read a bit here from the portion where they just talk about the album itself. When Ultra was released on April 14th of 97, the media pounced on Dave's drug story. The first interviews ended up being an extended therapy session for him. At first, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about it, but I'm not so sure anymore. Actually, I regret talking about it, at least to the press, Dave told Music Express. People should try and concentrate on positive things. And that's exactly what the fans did. They were relieved that Depeche Mode had brought out a new album after all the problems of the previous years. In Germany and the UK, Ultra climbed to number 1 on the album charts, number 5 in the US. On May 7th, Depeche Mode recorded It's No Good for a German comedy show, RTL Samstag, which was broadcast on May 10th. Another performance followed on May 15th on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. 97 was also the year the band made the leap into the internet age. On May 13th, DepecheMode.com went live for the first time, initially to promote the new album. It has remained the band's official website ever since. In contrast to the two previous albums, this time Depeche Mode did not tour and kept a relatively low profile with only a few TV performances and 2 live sets at record release parties in London and Los Angeles. The band wanted to avoid the stress of a new tour and not just for Dave's sake. For me, when I go back and I look at all the promotion around Ultra, I'm looking at the different artwork and posters that were released, the album cover itself, the photographs that Anton took. I know that at the time, it felt like this was a new band in a certain way. And I mean that from I know it's still Depeche Mode. And the music still sounds Depeche Mode. The first time that I heard Barrel of a Gun was when K-Rock Radio in LA played it. I believe they actually got the title wrong, and the DJ called it Bullet from a Gun. But I remember recording it and then listening to it every night before I went to bed on my crappy little modular stereo in my crappy little apartment in Anaheim, California, just a mile away from Knott's Berry Farm. The song itself, I thought, was this interesting sort of bridge to what was Songs of Faith and Devotion, because it still had that sort of grittiness to it. It had, like, not that you could have put Barrel of a Gun on Songs of Faith and Devotion, but it wasn't so far removed from Songs of Faith and Devotion while still being something new. I kind of agree with the comment that was made on here, where, you know, being hard to, where it said, let me back up here in the book. The song was everything but easy to listen to. That's really accurate. That's not to say the song wasn't enjoyable. It was. But it was a challenging track. It certainly wasn't something that, for me, was an instant earworm or had a hook to it. No, there was an intensity to it that kind of sucked you in. It was very seductive in that way. And the album kind of serves as that too. I completely understand, while I don't have Ultra that high up on the list as many of you do, I do understand why people love it so much. But that entire time period, it felt like a starting over. And it felt like the band had been destroyed and torn down, and yet through Ultra, it was this rebuilding process. And even the artwork to me, and how rough sort of the stamp imagery of the logo looked, and the way that Anton took the photographs, it was as if the band wasn't quite. It was rebuilding itself, and this all felt like it was all very, brick and mortar. As the band sort of reformed and built itself back up, and then was able to come back to life. When it came to the release of the singles album and the singles tour and Dave, that was almost like a rebirth. We're going to celebrate these things that we had done in the past as we embark on this tour. The tour itself had, I don't want to say it was a light air about it, but it certainly was more colorful. The way that the graphics were chosen and the graphic designer for the release of the singles album. And while the extra tracks that we got still kind of fell in line with what we had received with Ultra, the packaging around it was one of celebration, with the just those blues and the reds. And then, of course, the band is off on their, the second part of their career with, without Alan. And they continued, as we, talk about to this day, with the end of the Memento Mori era. That time around Ultra, though, was just incredibly, incredibly unique and special. I'll never forget going to one of the launch parties in L.A. at a small club, wondering if, I told this story before, so I won't repeat it again, for you that have gone back and actually tortured yourselves by listening to all the back catalog of my podcast. But going with my buddy Jeff Shamrock, who I went to the Academy of Radio Broadcasting with, and going to that club. They had all the flats for the artwork for Ultra there, and they were playing some of the select songs. I'll never forget listening to Kevin and Bean on K-Rock, where they played a handful of songs, and I recorded them driving around my beat-up Volkswagen at the time, and listening to it on my... it was a handheld stereo that I had in the car, because my stereo had gotten stolen at one point in time. Again, just all these memories that come flooding back during that era. So, again, love to hear from you. TalkShowNerd at gmail.com, or leave a comment up on YouTube. So, in the middle of while I'm recording the podcast right now, I received a message from Chris Thorne on Instagram as I get into listener feedback this week. Thought experiment John, you're in charge of the merch department for a day, plundering anything from 81 to 2024. You get one music release, one piece of apparel, and one collectible. What are you going for? So he writes, I'm going with release an album of the songs in their form as musically arranged on the Memento Mori tour. Everything Counts intro is perfect. In terms of a piece of apparel, caps with B-side song titles on. My Joy, Sibling, Corrupt, Sea of Sin. Finally, a collectible would be a page of songwriting notes from the Playing the Angels session when I first discovered the band. All right, so I haven't had a ton of time to think about this. It's the last one of the collectible that I'm probably stuck on the most. I'd love to have a piece of musical equipment, but I'll get to that in a second. So in terms of the music release, if I was in charge of the merch department, I would love for an album that consists of one track from every single album, going back to Speak and Spell. One track from every album that Martin and Dave chose together. So they sat down and they hammered out they could pick one song from every single album and put it on a collection. But they had to agree on what the song was from every single album. I would love to have something like that. Piece of apparel, I'd want the Violator white t-shirt with the blue flower on it and the DM with the tour dates on the back. I love that shirt. It takes me right back to that time period. I think the easy pull would have been the shirt for 101 that was sold, but I think I go back to Violator. I love that shirt and just that time period around that tour. In terms of a collectible, again, I'd like to have a musical instrument, or a microphone. A microphone that Dave used in recording of an album. If there was, and I probably would go and choose something from Songs of Faith and Devotion. The other thought that I had was the bong that was used, the bong speaker that was used in the videos during the Never Let Me Down era. I'd love to have the bong, the one that's sitting in the chair for the video. I think it's behind the wheel, right? So, for those of you that want to play along, again, you're in charge of the merch department for one day. Anything from 81 to 24, what are you going to choose? You get one music release, one piece of apparel, one collectible. I can already hear a friend of the show, Matt, frantically typing against the keyboard as I speak. Something tells me, Matt, that you had your immediate choices. You had your choices immediately, and there was no delay. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. All right, Mr. Kavandi, I'm probably saying that wrong, Kvaandi, says, my top 3 albums, Ultra Playing the Angel and Memento Mori. Interesting. Thank you for the feedback on that. I just love how it's also subjective. That's fantastic. All right, friend of the show, Dave Fulton, writes this. If you think about the marketplace for music back in the 1980s, there was a lot of pressure on acts. You have to forgive me. It's Thursday, doing a weekly radio show, and sometimes my voice just gets wonky later on in the day. Going back to the 1980s, there was a lot of pressure on acts to release longer albums than CDs. The new format on the block could hold only so much more music than a standard album or cassette tape. I recall Def Leppard's Hysteria release 1 month before Music for the Masses having a big sticker on the label that said 63 minutes of music. Depeche Mode's reliance at the time on Martin's song production meant that any CD release was bound to look somewhat skimpy. The solution was to pad the CD with B-sides, Pleasure Little Treasure, full instrumentals like Agent Orange, remixes, Never Let Me Down Again, the Aggro Mix, to Having to Hold, Spanish Taster, and this all goes back to the conversation that I had on last week's episode. Note that in 1988, Speak and Spell was re-released on CD with all the B-sides, remixes, and the non-album version of Dreaming of Me. I suspect the band wasn't a fan of fattening the CDs this way, as it does tend to dilute any attempt at sequencing a thoughtful track listing. I know that, I believe it was Brat on the Depeche Mode Halo forum had recently come out and asked about whether or not they should split up the albums and the deluxe editions. Because I realized as of late that the deluxe editions, when you go to look at the Depeche Mode music, say on Apple iTunes, they don't have it. They don't have the mastered versions anymore. The mastered versions are actually now the deluxe editions. So he was asking whether or not they should release the albums by themselves and then deluxe editions, or just keep the deluxe editions since they have all the subsequent remixes and whatnot. I am a fan of making both available. If you have the opportunity and it doesn't cost any more money, while I have the physical releases, it would be nice to be able to, because I've had this issue before when I've gone out for a bike ride or something. You know, I would actually go and build just the album in a playlist so that it didn't have the extra tracks on there as well. I mean, it's splitting hairs, but I think it would be nice to just have the original album version available to go and listen to, as opposed to the entirety of what was released during that time period. Never Turn Your Back, getting back to Dave, Never Turn Your Back on Mother Earth was played live during Martin's sets at a total of 4 shows during the second leg of the Masses tour. Alan created original backing tracks for the song for those performances. A demo of the song was first released as a gift in the form of a flexi disc to British fan club members as an insert in the Christmas edition of Bong magazine. For these reasons, the songs can therefore be considered an official cover of the Sparks tune by Depeche Mode. Call it the Mandela effect, but I have such a strong, erroneous memory of seeing To Having to Hold played live. I can see a sweaty Dave working his way deliberately through the tune with great intensity. But I am probably confusing a memory of his immaculate live run-through of Clean, which has a similar vibe. Oh, what a criminal pity that World Violation of all tours doesn't have an official recording. Evidently, fans of the video game Fallout can locate the use of To Having to Hold across several editions of the game. Would love some confirmation of that. I'm more of a Portal player myself, writes a friend of the show, Dave Fulton, and thank you for the feedback. Lastly, this week, we go to Adam Barker, who writes this. My name is John. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. That's not Adam Barker. There's 2 more here. Adam Barker writes, many great DM albums, but my top 3 are Memento Mori, Songs of Faith and Devotion, and Violator. My apologies. Thank you, Adam Barker, though, for the feedback. John Sayers from Dublin. That is who we're hearing from. 55 years old, Dublin, Ireland. Dublin in Ireland. Been a DM fan since A Broken Frame, when I feel they went dark straight away with See You. Not that I don't like Speak and Spell. I did. I just prefer the darker version of Depeche Mode. I have 2 questions and 1 suggestion, which I hope you find interesting. Question 1. I just want to ask about your recent podcast on Depeche Mode albums from Black Celebration through Songs of Faith and Devotion, which I take it you think was a long peak for Depeche Mode in terms of song quality and production. I agree. However, I personally think Depeche Mode went on a 5-album, 10-10 streak from Black Celebration through Ultra. Not a lot of groups can say that. And again, this goes back to that continued feedback that I get and the love for Ultra. Do you consider Ultra to be one of the lesser quality in terms of song quality production than the other 4? I think Ultra was fantastic. No skips. Every song is absolutely amazing, right up there for with others for me. So, no, I love Ultra. And actually, if I go through a ranking, I think we did that a while back. If I went through a ranking, it's going to be higher up than I think initially my brain takes the album to. There's a couple of tracks on Ultra that just never really stuck with me. Free State probably being the one that I'll listen to it and I'll enjoy it, but it's not one that I straight away go to seek out. And yeah, now that I'm thinking about it, it's an exercise that I went through with Matt where we went through and tried to rank all the albums. I think one of the reasons why Ultra doesn't typically pop up as top of mind for me, it's the lack of the era being as extensive as all the other albums. Because we didn't have a tour, because this was the transition album, we'd had these albums, these 2 albums just that, propelled Depeche Mode into the stratosphere with Violator and Songs of Faith and Devotion. And Ultra came at a time when I think a lot of fans of Depeche Mode to that time started to pitch off. Whether it's because Alan left the band, whether it's because, we were all getting older at the time and there's an aging out. But just the era around Ultra just was always sort of tinged with this, what is going to happen to this band that I love? It's not the same as it was. It's not the same as it used to be anymore. And while I was never a devotee to Alan, I loved his contributions to the band, but I've loved the band since Alan left, and I've never been one to go and say, Alan needs to return. That era just had so many question marks around it, and the lack of a tour to propel the album further and knowing what the band was going through, I think that's why it just kind of takes a step down for me. Question 2, do you or the listeners think there's any correlation between being at your best professionally and your worst in terms of personal life? That's an interesting question. I think Depeche Mode were at their peak as artists, rock gods, songwriters, and performers during the entire Songs of Faith and Devotion devotional period and leading up to Ultra. However, they were at their worst in terms of substance and alcohol abuse, personal family relationships, breakdowns in inter-band relationships. I'm not being controversial here. All of this is known and has been documented. Albums after Ultra, when things had calmed down and their lives were normal, for want of a better word, the quality of work took a dip, in my opinion. He writes, I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts on this. I'm pretty sure I could find other examples of other bands who also fit this conclusion of mine. The Beatles, Bowie, perhaps. I don't know if this is exclusive to the creative process. I can speak for me personally in terms of my work. I think that, first off, perhaps when it comes to the creation of music and going through hard times, there's a level of emotion that ends up showing through the music and that you're creating, your vocal performances, the style of the music. If you're dealing with recovering from abuse or going through personal emotional issues, then the the music becomes cathartic for you, and your pain, which often sometimes elevates, many times, right? The level and type of work you're doing, it makes it more relatable to individuals, compelling and interesting. That might be more exclusive to the creative process in terms of music, perhaps art in general. I know for me personally, as a radio talk show host, the tail end of 2021, all of 2022 was honestly my worst years ever. That I can think of. It was just awful on numerous fronts. Losing of friends, dealing with my own emotional issues, my own issues. And I know that in terms of my own radio work, I can't imagine that it was beneficial during that time period. I feel like when I'm in a better emotional state and I'm happy like I am now and healthy and not dealing with all those things, that I'm much better. I'm a much better talk show host than I was back then. But then again, who knows? I mean, maybe if I were to go back and listen to those shows, there's an element of desperation or pain that I was feeling at the time. I just know that it was very difficult back then going into work. So I think this might be something that's more in line with the creative process. Lastly, John writes, I think it'd be really interesting for you to interview fans every now and again. I do too. Or even make it a regular part of your show. 5 or 10 minutes, standard questions, and then some general chat. Your amazing podcasts connect us all in our love of Depeche Mode. Yeah, and I completely agree with you. It's why we had Rob on recently. Again, it often comes down to just scheduling the time, not knowing exactly when I'm going to be able to sit down and record the podcast. Thankfully, that day, it was like that morning I reached out to Rob, and I was like, hey, you want to come on the show today? And he actually had some time. I would love to hear how others started their DM journey, their favorite songs, B-sides, album, concerts, amazing Depeche Mode moment they can't forget. Could be first time you heard a certain song, a concert you attended, a moment, seeing a video. Could be anything. I appreciate it may be complicated to arrange, but maybe not with technology these days. You would be inundated with volunteers, so selecting whom may be the hard part, but I think it would be an amazing addition to an already amazing podcast. Well, thank you very much. I love the podcast, love Depeche Mode more than I can put into words. Look forward to all your future podcasts. Take care and best wishes from Dublin. No, that is the plan. Like I said, it really just comes down to making sure that I can schedule the time with the individual. And, I do this as a hobby. I'm not making a ton off of this, of this podcast. I do it because my love of the band, and I love the fact that I get to interact with fans. I find it incredibly rewarding. So I'd love to be able to make a ton of money off this, but I don't. I just do it, like I said, because of my fandom. So that is the plan moving forward, to have more guests on the show. I just appreciate the fact that you guys listen every single week. This was another one of those episodes where I fully expected this is going to last like 15, 20 minutes, and pushing close to 50. And I still have a Star Wars podcast that I have to go and record. All right, listen, before I let you go, if you love Depeche Mode and you read science fiction, check out my science fiction series, EMBARK. It is set in the future where air and spaceflight culture has replaced car culture. It's a lot of Depeche Mode references, direct and indirect, in the story. The main character of the story, it's largely based on me, I'm not going to lie. But he's a massive Depeche Mode fan at a time in the narrative when I made the music of the 80s through the 2000s nostalgic and popular among the characters of the story. It's so funny, I've had, most non-Depeche Mode fans reading my science fiction novels, and I get people say, you have horrible taste in music. See, I don't think Depeche Mode fans would be saying that, because you would know the songs that I was referencing. The stories do feature references to Depeche Mode while telling an exciting science fiction space opera saga. As Earth faces its end, follow pilots Taft, Keitha, and their crew on a journey of survival across the galaxy as they fight for their future far from Earth. The description of Book 1 is as follows. Keitha's father died 1 year ago. Yesterday, he gave her the key to saving humanity. She just doesn't know it yet. With interstellar travel possible, pilots are the future, and Keitha Morrow trained to be the best. But when an industrial accident sets off an apocalyptic chain of events, she'll need more than her skills to survive. as a tyrannical enemy emerges to exploit the disaster and gain control. Keith is given a fighting chance when a cryptic message from her late aerospace engineer father leads her and fellow pilot Taft Guardia to what may be the only hope of ending the conflict. While Taft and a ragtag squadron of Earth's evacuees fight to save humanity from annihilation, Keitha must solve the mystery of what her father left behind before it's too late. If you like science fiction to be epic, filled with some romance, action, and a lot of cool technology, and a little bit of Depeche Mode, EMBARK is perfect for you. It's written for adults, but great for ages 11 plus. Pick up EMBARK Book 1 today. Ebook, Kindle Unlimited, hardcover, paperback, and audiobook. Amazon.com. Search for EMBARK and Jon, that's Jon, Jon Justice. 7 books in all in the series available now. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast. I hope wherever you are happy, you are healthy, you are safe. God bless, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.
Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Dave Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to
My